Today is February 17th, 2022, and we're on verse 3.8, and we're going to do verses 13 through 15. And as we've done before, I will just read through the first two verses. They have no purports, and that's why we're reading through them. Tasyarta sukshma binivishtadrashter antargatorto rajasataniyan gunerna kalanugatena vidha sushyangs tadabidyatana bideshat. The subtle subject matter of creation on which the Lord's attention was fixed was agitated by the material motive passion. And thus, the subtle form of creation pierced through his abdomen. Here, that was 13, this is 14. Sa padma kosha sahasodatishtat kalena karma pratibodhanena svarotishatat shalilam vishalam vidyotayan arka ivatma yonihi. Piercing through the sum total form of the fruitive activity of the living entities, piercing through this sum total form of the fruitive activity of the living entities took the shape of a bud of a lotus flower generated from the personality of Vishnu. And by his supreme will, it illuminated everything like the sun and dried up the vast waters of devastation. Now here is actually a verse we will do responsively. This is 3.8.15. Taloka padman sa'u eva Vishnu. Taloka padman sa'u eva Vishnu. Pravivishat sarva gunava bhasam. Pravivishat sarva gunava bhasam. Tasmin swayam vedamayo Tasmin swayam vedamayo vidhata. Tasmin swayam vedamayo vidhata. Swayam bhuvam yam smavadanti sobhut. Swayam bhuvam yam smavadanti sobhut. Taloka padman sa'eva Vishnu. Pravivishat sarva gunava bhasam. Tasmin swayam vedamayo vidhata. Swayam bhuvam yang smavadanti sobhut. Saloka padmang saha eva Vishnu. Pravivishat sarva gunava bhasam. Tasmin swayam vedamayo vidhata. Swayam bhuvam yang smavadanti sobhut. Talaloka Padmam Saeva Vishnu Pravi Vishat Sarva Guna Vabhasam Tasmin Swayang Veda Mayo Vidhata Swayam Bhuvam Yang Smavadati So Bhut Tat. That. Loka, universal. Padmam, lotus flower. Saha, he. U, certainly. Eva, factually. Vishnu, the Lord. Pravivisat, entered into. Sarva, all. Guna avabhasam, reservoir of all the modes of nature. Tasmin, in which. Swayam, in person. Vedamayaha, the personality of Vedic wisdom. Vidhata, controller of the universe. Swayam bhuvam, self-born. Yam, whom. Sma, in the past. Vadanti, do say. Saha, he. Abhut, generated. So the translation is as follows. Into that universal lotus flower, Lord Vishnu personally entered as the supersoul. And when it was thus impregnated with all the modes of material nature, the personality of Vedic wisdom, whom we call the self-born, was generated. So I say, and you please repeat. Into that universal lotus flower, Lord Vishnu personally entered as the supersoul. And when it was thus impregnated with all the modes of material nature, the personality of Vedic wisdom, who we call the self-born, was generated. All right, so here's the purport. The lotus flower is the universal Burak form, or the gigantic form of the Lord in the material world. It becomes amalgamated in the personality of Godhead Vishnu, in his abdomen, at the time of dissolution, and it becomes manifest at the time of creation. This is due to Garbha Vishnu, who enters into each of the universes in this form. In this form is the sum total of all the fruitive activities of the living entities conditioned by material nature. And the first of them, namely Brahma, or the controller of the universe, is generated from this lotus flower. This firstborn living being, unlike the others, has no material father, and thus he is called self-born, or Swayambhu. He goes to sleep with Narayan at the time of devastation, and when there is another creation, he is born in this way. From this description, we have the conception of three: the gross Virat form, the subtle Hiranyagarbha, and the material creative force, Brahma. Sataloka Padmang Saeva Vishnu Pravivisat Sarva Gunavabhasam Tasmin Swayam Veda Mayo Vidhata Swayam Bhuvam Yam Smavadanti So Bhut. Into that universal lotus flower, Lord Vishnu personally entered as the supersoul. And when it was thus impregnated with all the modes of material nature, the personality of Vedic wisdom, whom we call the self-born, was generated. All right. So I hope you all don't mind that sometimes I exaggerate the Sanskrit pronunciation. I'm trying to, impress it into my mind. So I know that it's kind of a little overmuch sometimes, but I do it just so that I can gradually hear the different sounds between the letters that don't exist in English and so forth. So sometimes I exaggerate the letters or the sounds of the Sanskrit pronunciation. So this section, chapter 8 of Srimad Bhagavatam, has to do with Maitreya replying to the questions that were put forth by Vidura. And he's starting off with explaining the creation of the universe. So 1 through 9 in this chapter was kind of an explanation of, the beginning of creation, kind of a prelude, and then 10 through 22, or 10 through 21 is where we are now. And this is where we hear about the birth of Brahma. And then from 22 to 33, which is the last of the chapter, we'll be hearing about the prayers of Brahma to the Supreme Lord to help him with the process of creation. So we know that Brahma was kind of bewildered when he first came out of the lotus flower. And so he tried many things, he just saw darkness in all directions. He tried crawling down the lotus flower, and after going a long distance, he came up, in one account it tells that he came across the Sudarshan chakra, and that frightened him, so he didn't go any further. And in one sense, this is the fate. This is the fate of all empirical knowledge. That empiric knowledge means that we just go out and we try to understand everything from investigating it. So this is what Brahma was doing. He was investigating the lotus flower. What else did he have to investigate? There wasn't anything else. So he was being the first archetypal scientist, and he crawled down the lotus flower. He couldn't get anywhere, but he was finally met with the Sudarshan chakra, which I guess is what happens to all of us scientists, that at some point, whatever we investigate, we met with the Sudarshan chakra of death, So, and you can never get to the bottom of anything. The universe is just way too complicated. But you can find out new things, so there's no harm in science. We're not bashing science here. We're just bashing science as a tool for understanding the essence of what's going on in this weird world that we live in. That science is incapable of doing. Because the way this world is set up, the interesting thing about the material universe is that it has many things that look like something other than what they actually are. Things look a certain way, but actually they're a different way than the way they look. Everything looks like it's going to go on forever, but of course we know that it will not go on forever. Things will eventually fall into decay as pralaya, various kinds of annihilation occur. So this particular section is pointing the focus on Brahma being generated from the lotus flower. So Vishnu, as our inimitable Natabar was giving us an explanation yesterday, that he's sleeping with half-closed eyes, but he's not really sleeping. He's only appears to be sleeping, but he's in a kind of a trance of pleasure, and he doesn't have to work hard at anything. So we have first the Maha Vishnu, who generates all the universes. They're like thousands of bubbles coming out of his pores and out of his breathing, and they fill up the material realm. And then into each one he enters again as Garbha Vishnu, And again, it's a similar thing. One of the items that we'll notice a lot in the explanation of the creation of the universe, and not just the creation of the universe, you see this everywhere, is the kind of self-similarness of different structures to this universe. So at one scale, things look a certain way, but when we go a little bit smaller, they still look the same way. There's a similarity there. So we have an Ananta Shesha that holds up all the universes, and inside each universe we have an Ananta Shesha that holds up the planets. We have a Maha Vishnu that's big and he's expanding all the universes, and inside each universe we have a Garbha Vishnu that's expanding the planets. So the Maha Vishnu, he is sleeping, not Maha Vishnu, but the Garbha Vishnu, he's sleeping, and he is agitated, as we just read, by the desires of the living entities. So a force begins to generate, and from his navel suddenly, miraculously appears a lotus flower. And this lotus flower is actually the beginning stages of the universe. And it's also sometimes called the universe. And sometimes it's called the Hiranyagarbha. So the word Hiranyagarbha gets used in a lot of different ways. So the universe, with all the living entities, bursts forth, and the first thing that comes out of it is, of course, Lord Brahma. So Lord Brahma, he is the first generated, and as we read today, he's called Swayambhu, because he doesn't have a mother or father. He comes directly from this generation. So this bud, coming from the navel of Garbha Vishnu, grows out. And later on in the 5th canto, we'll find that the lotus flower is like the entire universal cosmic system. So Brahma will take it and develop it. And we find out that this pole star, or what we call Dhruvaloka in modern terminology, it's Beta Ursa Minoris, there's a star that's at the pole. And all the stars seem to orbit around it. So, and that's called the Navel of Vishnu. So here we tie that all back in. So this is the Navel of Vishnu. And so Brahma is trying to understand what to do. And we're going to read about how he deals with it. There's several different accounts, and they're somewhat a little bit different. He's bewildered, and he hears the word tapa, and then he meditates. In Brahma Samhita, we hear that he's wondering what to do, and he hears the flute of Krishna, and by hearing the flute, he hears first the Kam Gayatri, there's 2 Kam Gayatris, or ones that are part of that whole Gayatri system, and then from that he gets an understanding and begins to understand the Vedic knowledge. But at any rate, the point here is that this material world is a world that is made out of atoms and material substance. We've heard about that before, how the 24 elements of Sankhya philosophy are generated. So the scientists, they study the atoms and molecules and how they combine and their various properties and so forth. But the shapes and the substances that we have, our bodies, the food we eat, tables, the clothing, everything in everyday life is created with these atoms the same way that a pixel a pixelated image is created on a television screen, like right now. You see that, of course, there's not a very, elaborate picture on the screen. But there's rows and rows of pixels there. And each one has a position. And each one has 3 numbers associated with it that are red, green, and blue. And depending on what those numbers are is what color it is and how bright it is. And so therefore, by adjusting these colors, you can see that there's millions and millions of pixels on the screen. And the screen can appear to move, and it can be the picture of a human being, it can be the picture of a landscape, it can be the picture of so many different things. And we see the human being, but we know that it's only the image of the human being. It's not the human being. We can see the landscape, but we know it's the image of the landscape. It's not the landscape. And if you're real hungry, maybe some of you are already getting near prasadam time, you might see a wonderful set of prasadam as a picture, but you can't eat it. But you know somewhere there is prasadam. It's an image of prasadam. So in the same way, these atoms on a 3D level make up this apparent reality. We look like people, we are people, but in one sense, only a 3D version of it. There's a 4D version of it beyond us, where there's a real world that isn't made of atoms, it's made of the energies of Krishna, where things happen the way they happen. And they don't need to come together in various atomic combinations and interact with one another through various, intermediate bosons and all that kind of stuff. They don't need to do those things. Because they're energies of Krishna, they're not designed that way. The atoms and molecules of this world are purposely designed in a very restricted way, that they only come together in one way and not in another way. And because of that, everything in the material world takes a lot of planning and thinking and organizing. And so when we watch what happens when we digest food, we learn that there's thousands of chemical reactions going on. And then those chemical reactions usually break things down into proteins and sugars and various other things. And then eventually it's distributed into the bloodstream through the small intestine, and then the various cells can make use of various kinds of items that are there. And because they are able to do that, then the organism thrives. But that's not the whole picture. Of course, this is the way that everything works in the material world, this clumsy and very multi-level way of accomplishing everything. Everything has to be accomplished with lots of steps. And that's why the universe is so complex. And when the scientists study it, they just get lost in that complexity. And if you don't circle around to Krishna, you also get lost in the complexity. You'll never understand where things really come from, what they're about, or anything. So, what scientists study, what physicists study, what chemists study, what biologists study is nothing more than the specific sort of chains or limitations that this material energy imposes on the living entity. Because otherwise, if we were in our spiritual form, we wouldn't have these limitations. We wouldn't have to worry about stomach acid or glasses. We wouldn't worry about meter maids or about, overdue IRS bills or any of these kind of things. These don't happen in the spiritual world. And there's no need for them. And all this detail is unnecessary in the spiritual world. Human beings can walk without needing bones or any of those other things. There's no necessity for all those details. So when people are proud of their scientific knowledge, they're only proud of studying and understanding the limitations, and that's all they are, the limitations of this material world. So, when we study the material world without Krishna, we are subject to the four, count them, four frailties or, defects of the living entity. And they are. I'm going to do like our Arjuna Nanda does, and ask, can we have the little pass around mic? He's got it, okay. So what is one of the four defects of the living entity?
A tendency to be illusioned.
What's that?
Tendency to be illusioned.
Illusion, okay, that's one. What's another one?
Imperfect senses.
Imperfect senses.
We are making mistakes.
Make mistakes. And what's the biggest one?
Cheating propensity.
Cheating propensity, right. So we are cheaters. So these four things, illusion, tendency to make mistakes, cheating, and imperfect senses. Our senses do not see beyond a certain scope. When we see things, we make mistakes about them. So we have some desire, and generally we act in accordance with our material desires, but sometimes the exact opposite result happens, and we call that a mistake. So, and beyond that, we tend to be illusioned. Although we see things, and we may adequately be able to see what's around us or adequately act in ways that are not a mistaken way of acting, but still we don't understand the whole situation. We're in illusion about the whole picture. So as a result, we're also acting incorrectly. And finally, when people discover this, we cheat. So that's the nature of the living entity. Without Krishna's help, these things would be overwhelming. So, we have been discussing before these kind of ignorance that are levied or lowered upon the living entities when they come here, because we would not be able to deal with the limitations here of this world if it wasn't that our understanding and memory of the spiritual world wasn't obfuscated. So, because we don't remember what it was like to be in the spiritual world, we're fine with this place. We think that this is the only place. And however much we've cultivated ignorance, we also make even bigger and bigger mistakes. We're even in deeper and deeper illusion, where we see less and less of what's really going on. And that's why we learn about the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And in this understanding of how the universe unfolds, we are going to see many similar structures. We just talked about how you've got Maha Vishnu, and then he expands into Garbha Vishnu, thousands and thousands and millions of Garbha Vishnus for each universe. And then in each universe, Garbha Vishnu further expands into who? Kshira Vishnu. All right, so there's a further expansion. And Kshira Vishnu is the supersoul. So in this lotus flower are the living entities, but they're only still asleep in their subtle bodies. So we learn that the material universe, if you're still working out your material karma and desires at the end of the universe, you just go to sleep. Of course, the universe is destroyed and you die, but you are then asleep in the body of Vishnu, Garbha Vishnu in this case. If the whole universe and the entire material cosmic manifestation is shuttered, then you go to sleep in Maha Vishnu's body. But if it's just Garbha Vishnu, you go there. Plus your material desires are remembered, and you kind of put a bookmark there. And then when Vishnu is agitated, Garbha Vishnu is agitated, and this lotus flower grows, and eventually these living entities need to come out and do their little dancing on the material planet, so they can try to enjoy their various material plans, which never work. But they will try to enjoy them anyway. So this is the nature. So we have the three Vishnus expanding this way. We find out a lot of other self-similar things. We have Bhumandala, the great ring or disc that is sometimes called Earth. And we have Bhugola, which is the planet that we see when they have these satellites flying around. So we have the globe Earth, and we have the flat, larger Earth that we don't see, which is also, both are called Bhu, but one is Bhumandala and the other is Bhugola. So again, you have two things that are similar, but there's some differences, and they have the similar names, so it's easy to get them confused. And then in Bhumandala, we have 7 islands and 7 oceans that are rings, and the center is Jambudweep. And in Jambudweep, it's further divided into 9 varshas, and the southernmost bottom portion is also divided into 9 varshas. So we have varshas and then we have khandas. So you see how this idea of repetition or similarity at different scales is working. And one of the things that helped me with understanding this principle is the mathematical concept of the Mandelbrot Set, or fractals. So fractals are exactly that same thing, where something is similar to itself, but at smaller scales. And to kind of get the idea across, I thought that I might do a presentation, if we can get it to work here, of a video which kind of explains fractals, and we begin to see how they're everywhere, and all natural things in our world have this fractal quality. I'm going to wait for it to awaken. Oh, it's up, but it's still doing its deal. Fractals were discovered first by a French Jewish man born in Poland named Benoit Mandelbrot. And he fled the area where he grew up during the Second World War, and he came to the United States. And he discovered fractals. But of course, in one sense, before him, there were other people who also had dealt with fractals. There was a mathematician named Koch. What's that? Oh, I see. Okay. See, what happens if we do this is when you put it on YouTube, you'll get a copyright strike on it, because that's the problem. But on the YouTube, we can upload the URL, so you can actually go and see the video on your thing. And that's why I'm a little bit afraid to do this. I had this already happen a couple of times, you know. So, what's that? Right. So if it's on the video, then you have to block it out, or you have to get the copyright okay by the people and this and that and the other. I've already gone through this rigmarole with Google YouTube a number of times, so that's why I'm not so eager to do it. What's happening here? It's not turning on. Okay, maybe now we're finally getting something. Something is amiss here. Why is it doing this? Okay. So let's give it another shot here. Pause and ponder. Let me see if I can figure out how to get the sound over to this thing.
One example is the fern in this image. Here's what a whole fern looks like. Now if we zoom into one leaf, look, it looks like the whole fern.
So I'm trying to remember what it takes to get the audio. Maybe this will do it.
Today, let's have some fun with fractals. To start with, what are fractals? You've probably seen tons of fractals in nature, but you just did not know that they are fractals. One example is the fern in this image. Here's what a whole fern looks like. Now if we zoom into one leaf, look, it looks like the whole fern. Now let's zoom in even more, and look at this, it looks like the fern again. Some flowers are also fractal. At first sight, if we see this bunch of flowers, we can see that the bunch is made up of many small flowers. But actually, if you look closer, each of the small flowers is made up of even smaller portions. Just the same way that each portion makes up the small flowers, each small flower also makes up the whole bunch. So each of these smaller portions is in fact similar to each of the flowers and even to the bunch. This is also an example of a fractal pattern. Another fractal is a broccoli. And don't we all really love broccoli? As you can see, each of the heads of the broccoli resembles the vegetable as a whole. Now that you've seen these examples of fractals, you can probably spot your next fractal in nature by yourself. So what exactly are fractals? The word fractals comes from the Latin verb to break. Fractals are geometric patterns in which every smaller part of the structure is similar to the whole. How do we actually create a fractal? Let's first look at the Serpinski Triangle. It does look complicated, but we can create this in a few simple steps. Let's start with the black triangle. We can mark the center of each side of the triangle and connect the dots to make a new upside-down triangle. We then remove this triangle and are left with 3 smaller black triangles instead of 1. We take the centers of each of the 3 new triangles and again connect the dots to make 3 new upside-down triangles. Let's remove the upside-down triangle at the top. Look, we get 3 new triangles instead of the one at the top. We can now remove the one at the bottom left and finally the one at the bottom right. You'll notice that each time we remove an upside-down triangle, we get 3 new black triangles. So now we have a total of 9 even smaller black triangles. Let's see the triangles that we will remove in the next step. Now we can again take the top part of the big triangle and remove the upside down triangles. We can continue on to the bottom left and then the bottom right. We already have 27 black triangles. If we keep going, we can make more and more black triangles at each step. And if we keep doing this forever, we'll have an infinite number of triangles, and all inside the one big triangle we started with. Let's have another example. This one is called the Von Koch curve, named after the Swedish mathematician who came up with it. This time we start with a line and divide it into 3. We mark these points, then take out the middle. We take a line of equal length to the one we just removed and put it at an angle of 60 degrees. We can now connect the two lines, and this line happens to be equal in length to the line we just removed. So instead of one middle line, we have two new ones of the same length, making the curve longer. And notice that instead of one line segment, we now have 4 line segments. Now take each of these 4 new lines, divide them into 3, and take out the middle from each of them. Starting from the left, let's put in 2 new lines instead of the middles. You'll see that each of these lines is equal to the length of the ones we just removed, which means that the length of the curve increased again. We already have 16 line segments to work with. Let's take each of these and repeat the same steps. It's starting to look pretty. You can see that at every step, each time we add segments, we make the curve longer. If we keep repeating these steps, we make the curve longer and longer. Since we can keep repeating this forever, the length of the curve becomes infinite. This is what makes fractals special. Now we can move on to a more complicated and more beautiful structure, the Mandelbrot Set. As we can see if we zoom in, we recognize the original structure again. If we zoom in again, we again recognize the same structure as the original image. This keeps happening as we zoom in again and again, and at each step, the image retains its beauty as well. In this video, we saw the beauty of fractals. We showed you how to recognize them in nature, and even how to create some simple fractals. We hope you had some fun with fractals.
What this is showing us is that there's this mathematical concept of fractals. And at one time, these were called mathematical monsters in the world of mathematics, because there was a lot of things about them that didn't make sense to people. There's like the fractal, the Koch snowflake as we saw it. You keep making points on the points on the points on the points. It starts to look like a snowflake. So as you do it more and more, the volume stays at a certain point, but the perimeter becomes actually infinite, which is strange that you can make an object where you can see the whole perimeter, but still the perimeter is infinite because of all the insets and further insets and further insets like that. Now, in some recent years, around 2010 or something like that, there was a question, could you make fractals in 3D with mathematics? And in one sense you can't, but in another sense you can if you do it in a slightly different way. And so there were a couple of mathematicians, David White and Paul Nylander, who created Mandel bulbs. Now these are in 3 dimensions. And then someone named Tom Lowe discovered Mandel Boxes. And what's amazing about them is, imagine if you were going to walk towards the wall here in this room. And as you got closer to the wall, instead of smashing into the wall, as you got closer, you just got tinier. So as you got closer, you were also becoming very tiny. At a certain point, you would be able to see the pores in the wall and the paint, and you would never crash into the wall. It would you would be getting tinier, and you would see new details in the wall that you don't see now. And so that's what's happening in these fractals. So simply through doing mathematics and computers, there's no artist in these. That's one of the things that's hard to imagine, is the way these fractals look. There's no human artist involved. What's only involved is mathematics and plugging in numbers. And numbers themselves come up with these Mandelbrot sets on a 3D version, like there's this one here. No human being drew that or crafted it. This is just mathematics. Now, what you're seeing here is a 3D version of what you saw earlier. And this is a computer graphic that is changing your position in the fractal. And as you get closer to something, you get tinier. So you see that whatever you're looking at has details that you didn't see before because you were too big to see them. And with this mathematical structure, it never ends. You can get as close to something as you want, and you will finally see more and more details. And so, and these details are just chunked out by the computer on the fly as you're getting close, because you couldn't draw something like this in a single pass. The computer is drawing it as you get closer to something. It's changing what you're drawing, and it's recalculating everything. So that's what's actually happening. And it looks like architecture. Sometimes it looks like things that are underwater. Sometimes it looks like cities. But we see the same, a sort of similarity at all scales. But yet there's things that are different about it. It's the same, but a little bit different. And as you get close to something, that small thing becomes bigger and bigger until it becomes a world in itself. And then you lose track of where you are. Let me show you another one, because these others. Depending on how you do the numbers, you begin to see, different kinds of things. Now this looks like some kind of architecture. It takes a computer sometimes days to put this out, because the person creates the fractal and then creates the path through the fractal. And then as he creates the path through the fractal, the computer has to map it all out. So it takes a huge amount of computer time to generate this. And of course, then the computer turns it into what looks like a 3D image. And you can see these branches of branches, the same kind of thing. This begins to look organic, like you're looking at upside down trees or something, or a root system. And we see how this is everywhere in nature. This is kind of artwork by Krishna, as far as I can tell, This wasn't, no human artist could take the time to draw all these details. The details are automatically there. As a result of the math involved. And again, the closer you get to any little part of it, you'll discover that that little part becomes a whole world in itself. And then you become lost in that world. And depending on what numbers they're using, you get all this strange, variety of different things. Now you get things like this that look definitely very organic, like you're looking at moss on some kind of a thing. This is, again, no human artist made this. This is numbers plugged in to a computer generating these things, and they look very much like things humans would make or like organic things. This looks like some kind of city. Kind of reminds me of India in some ways. And this looks like some kind of futuristic city. Right. Looks like the Burj Khalifa or something. This looks like some kind of ruins in like Angkor Wat or something like that, The detail comes from the mathematics. It's not put in there by a human being. So that's what's so bizarre about it, Okay. So, anyway, so this idea of the world that we see, sometimes it's important to keep track of what level we're at, so we don't lose perspective, and we don't get confused by the fact that Krishna expands once, and he expands twice, and he expands 3 times, and the material universe has one structure and a smaller structure within it that's similar to it. This is the way that the whole material universe seems to be devised, it's just one of the aspects of it. So we're over time, and I should cap it here unless somebody has a really burning question,
More of a clarification, Mara. So basically, the connection then that we're seeing between the fractals and nature is understanding how Krishna's creations,
right,
so detailed and so intricate, how he's kind of thought about how to make all these things come about. That's the idea we get from the fractals.
Right. That Krishna can do this stuff automatically, and for some reason he likes that motif of having something and something smaller within that bigger something that looks in some ways similar to the bigger something. And then within that smaller something, there's even a smaller something that again looks similar to the bigger something. And this goes level and level and level down, till we have this world. And, just by watching those fractals, you can see how easy it is to get lost. Especially, it's hard enough to get lost in a 2D or a 3D surface, but here, your sizes also matters. So if you're getting very close to something that looks like a little spot from far away, as you get close to it, you get smaller, so that spot suddenly becomes an entire world in itself. And again, that's why unless you try to understand the material world through the agency of spiritual literature and spiritual devotees, the book Bhagavatam and the devotee Bhagavat, you'll never understand what's really going on here. It's too bewildering, it's too complex, and it's designed to be that way. It will just ultimately frustrate you. All right, so I don't want to get chastised for running over. Okay, go ahead, you can ask, but everyone else can leave if they want, so that...
Thank you, Maharaj, very much. It was a little bit like a revelation. What's our position in this material world? So I just wanted to confirm, does that mean that also in our spiritual practice, all the time we should be able to zoom in and zoom out
Yeah.
in order to be conscious at the same time for the different realities? Like, for example, you should be able to see at the same time your good qualities, but also your lacking of some qualities, and work with both at the same time.
Right. I think that it means also seeing the big picture, seeing the small picture, being able to zoom back and forth, and not being confused when sometimes the same word is used for two different things. Like when we say the earth, Varahadev lifted the earth. He didn't lift the earth planet. He lifted the flat earth structure, the Bhumandala that we don't see, So, some devotees have gotten really lost in all that stuff, because the same word is there, Bhu is there. But there's Bhugola and Bhumandala. They're not the same thing. They're related, and Bhugola is a tiny part of Bhumandala. So it's Bhugola is kind of like the solar system, whereas our little planet is just one part of it. So be aware of that. And when we're talking about Vishnu, which Vishnu are we talking about? Are we talking about Garbha Vishnu? Are we talking about Maha Vishnu or Kshira Vishnu? There are all these different Vishnus. And even there's different Shivas. And so it gets a little, and we see that Krishna's made the universe that way. It's bewildering. And it's supposed to be that way. It's his way of enjoying, and in the material world it's also his way of allowing atheists to have some room to, be bewildered. They can be bewildered by this, amazing world of, various things that just go on forever. But even if this small computer thing can be so bewildering, just imagine how the whole universe is so bewildering. We could do the same thing with biology. Maybe I'll show you that, of what's going on in a cell. It's just as mind-blowing as this is, that things that go on the cell, in the individual cell of every living entity are just bizarre beyond belief. Again, we see that there's something happening more than just chemistry, more than just matter. There's a entire other dimension. All right, at any rate, thank you all again for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.